So on behalf of the North American Native Plant Society, I welcome you to the first of two presentations that will be videotaped and made available online thanks to the generous funding from the McLean Foundation. Tonight, I am proud to present the acclaimed author and native plant expert extraordinaire, Lorraine Johnson, speaking on the topic Flowers and Food, Growing Edible Native Plants. Lorraine is the author of more than 10 books, including The New Ontario Naturalized Garden, 100 Easy-to-Grow Native Plants for Canadian Cities, and The Gardener's Manifesto. Her most recent book, and I saw some postcards on the chairs, is City Farmer, Adventures in Urban Food Growing. And that is a testimony to her expertise in urban agriculture, as is her leadership in compiling the Grow-TO Urban Agriculture Action Plan for Toronto, and I'm very pleased to say that the recommendations of which were accepted by Toronto City Council in 2012. She's currently at work on another book tentatively titled From Barnyard to Backyard, The Urban Livestock Revolution. And over the years, Lorraine has been involved with many organizations and initiatives, including the editorship of the Canadian Gardener's Guide, and I'm very proud to say the role of president of this illustrious organization from 1998 to 2001. And considering that this is our 30th anniversary and that we were basically the founding Native Plant Society in Canada, I just want to especially thank Lorraine for her leadership, back then when it was so important in getting NAPS off the ground. So in this talk, Lorraine Johnson combines two of the most popular topics of gardeners in Canada, and they are one and number two, and that is urban agriculture and native plant gardening. The fusion of these will be the visual feast we are about to enjoy this evening, and thus I invite you to welcome heartily Lorraine Johnson to the stage.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Janice, and thank you for coming to this talk. I'm really honored to be here and to be invited by the North American Native Plant Society to give this talk today. It feels a little bit like coming home, actually, because as Janice said, I was involved with the North American Native Plant Society a couple of decades ago now. So it's really nice to be invited to give this talk. It's funny that the idea of doing a talk on growing native edible plants had never occurred to me before, because I give a lot of talks about growing native plants, and I give a lot of talks about growing food in the city, and it had never really occurred to me to put those two topics together. But as Janice said, there's an incredible amount of interest out there right now in both native plants and in growing food, wherever you happen to be. So I have combined them, and I hope that you find it interesting. And I know many of you here are gardening with native plants. I see a number of people who, in fact, were my mentors a long time ago. So it is also due to the work that you are doing and North American Native Plant Society members are doing in propagating native plants that is keeping the momentum going. I know that when I first started thinking about eating, or for a long time when I thought about edible native plants, I thought only in terms of foraging. And I think that's a very common reaction. There've been so many books published about foraging for plants. A lot of them are about non-native plants, weeds, so-called. But there are some books about foraging native plants as well. And these are just a couple, actually, that I looked on my bookshelf, and I had a zillion. And I think that's really how people think about native plants. There's very little about actually growing native plants as a food source. There's lots about foraging, but I have to admit that I have a little bit of a mixed reaction to the whole idea of foraging. Part of me absolutely loves the idea. There's this visceral love of foraging. I mean, I think there might be a foraging gene in all of us that goes back to paleo times or something. But our native plant habitats, our native plant areas just can't sustain that sort of foraging anymore. We've lost so many, our natural areas are under so much stress that it's actually can be a problem if there's foraging. So what I really encourage people to do is a great alternative is to actually grow these native plants in your garden instead of foraging them from the wild. And I guess as well, I'm sort of borrowing some ideas from permaculture, which is a phrase permanent agriculture. And in the permaculture way of gardening, plants are chosen because they do more than one thing. They serve more than one function. I have always talked about native plants in terms of a number of functions, rarely about their edible, features. But here are some of the many functions that native plants in the garden serve, whether they're edible or not. I should say, of course, that a native plant, there are lots of different definitions, possible definitions for what a native plant is. In this talk, I'm basically using the term to mean a plant that existed here being Ontario, mainly southern Ontario, prior to European settlement. So it's an arbitrary date, but it's the one that's often chosen. So what that means is these plants have evolved over thousands of years for the conditions at hand. It means for the most part, and there are some exceptions, and there's one big caveat to what I'm about to say, and that's that if you match the plant to the conditions at hand. So if you plant a woodland native plant in your woodland conditions, chances are that your native plant is going to be very easy to grow compared to if you planted a non-native plant that needed to be nurtured along, that wouldn't grow on its own in the wild. So native plants tend to be lower maintenance. You can see by this Black-Eyed Susan basically growing in concrete. They, for the most part, they are tough if you match the plant to the conditions. They tend to require less in the way of supplementary watering, and this is really important in a time of resource scarcity and pressure on our resources. So to plant native plants, you'll, for the most part, and again, if you match the plant to the conditions, you won't need to do as much supplementary watering as you would with non-native plants. You certainly won't need to use any synthetic chemicals, any pesticides or herbicides. Native plant gardens tend to be more diverse gardens. You can encourage diversity in the native plant garden, certainly a lot more diversity than in the dominant landscape in North America, which is basically lawn. Gardening with native plants encourages wildlife. They've evolved over thousands of years together. There are insects whose mouth parts are perfectly matched to native plants. They require that native plant for food. So the interactions between wildlife and the native flora is very specific in a number of cases, and in your garden, gardening with native plants, you'll be sort of feeding that interaction between our native flora and our native fauna. There's been so much in the news lately about the loss of the honeybees and the kind of challenges for honeybees. Of course, honeybees are a non-native agricultural crop, basically, but our native bees are also very much in trouble, and they tend to you hear less about that really in the news. So by gardening with native plants, you are going to be helping the native pollinators, like our native bees as well. Those are some of the practical benefits of gardening with native plants and some of the functions that they serve in the garden. But I guess a bit less, or I guess a bit more ephemeral or benefit of gardening with native plant, and one that's very important to me, that I feel strongly about, is that it connects us to our home place. It's a way to assert a kind of identity about where we live and what makes where we live different from every other place. Gardening with native plants is very much a sort of connection with our local home place. And when everything is starting to look like everywhere else, the strip mall on the way into town, the same fast food places on the way into town, it's really nice that there are these things like native plants that actually speak specifically to where we are, wherever it might be. This, for example, could be anywhere in North America. This lawn, this garden right next door could only be where it is in the Texas Hill Country, or not could only be, but it speaks to where it is. You look at that garden, and if you've ever been to the Texas Hill Country, it will be very familiar to you, whereas right next door, the lawn could be anywhere. I think native plant gardening also encourages us to sort of look at our home place, to really pay attention to what's happening there, and the changes and all the wonderful creatures and the specificities of our soil and our weather and all those things. So it really encourages us to look at our home place. You can garden with native plants in any style that appeals to you. Except for this style. I would say it would be very hard to achieve this look using native plants. But other than that, you can garden kind of in a formal style if that appeals to you. I know that for a long time we talked a lot about native plants, and even, in fact, one of my books was called Grow Wild. So I kind of perpetuated the idea that, native plant gardening was all about this wild look. Now, personally, that really appeals to me, and I think there are lots of benefits and reasons or great things about that garden style. But if that doesn't appeal to you, you can still use native plants in a more formal style, and they'll still serve all those functions, those ecosystem functions that I've referred to. Now, with gardening with native plants for food, you might, in some cases, want a more kind of, like your vegetable garden looks. This, for example, is one of the raised beds in my backyard, and it is a plant called orach, Atriplex patula, and it is an edible native plant. And in some ways, I think of this almost as the poster plant for this talk, because one, a lot of people see this plant growing in the wild and think it's a weed, don't know it's a native plant, don't know it's edible, and yet in a garden it is incredibly useful. I basically eat this plant from May to September. It's my salad pretty well every night. It self-seeds. It is incredibly easy to grow. It is, in fact, it's a prolific self-seeder. So while there might be situations in which you don't want a plant to prolifically self-seed, if you're growing these for food, that's exactly what you want it to do. So that's just one example of the sort of native plant that we don't think about it as a food plant, an agricultural crop in the garden bed, but it can be grown that way and is incredibly useful. Actually, someone laughed at me when I told them, just at the Seedy Saturday that went on recently, I actually bought some more orach seeds, and someone said to me, "You bought orach seeds? We just spent like half a day pulling them out of our garden." So anyway, I'm going to start with talking mainly about some native trees, and then I'm going to, with edible features, and I'm going to talk about some native shrubs, and then I'm going to talk about vines and perennials. It was really hard to choose which ones to include. For sure, I am missing some of your favorites, I bet. You'll know of many others. We can talk about them afterwards. I've really just scratched the surface. I've tried to pick a mix of some that are familiar and some that are a bit less well known. I've tried to pick ones that are commercially available because, of course, I wouldn't. It's not a good idea to dig these plants from the wild, so it's important that they be available commercially. So I've also tried to pick ones that are native to Ontario. and ones that don't require a whole lot of processing, although that's a very fun area of the whole gardening with native plants, edible native plants, to get into, like acorns, to make flour out of acorns. A lot of work, a lot of processing, but pretty cool as well. But I've picked ones that don't require a lot. I've also tried to pick ones that don't have parts that are poisonous. There's a little bit of an exception, which I'll mention. But so one plant that I had to really force myself not to include, even though it's one of my favorite plants, is called pokeweed. It's called Phytolacca americana, and it is one of my favorite plants. And it is so beautiful, these white flowers, purple berries. It's an amazing plant. It's also almost all parts of it are very toxic. And some books even tell you to wash your hands when you touch it. And it's so alluring, but also toxic. But apparently you can eat the young shoots when they just come out. You can boil them like asparagus. But if you get any bit of root on it or any bit of leaf, you're in trouble. So anyway, I thought, well, we'll forget about those ones. I'm not suggesting that you can feed yourself, or that, it's a realistic goal to think that you could feed yourself entirely from your native plant edible garden. It's just, they're a great sort of supplement, I guess, and a really intriguing, fun added bonus to these plants. And some of them have really unusual flavors that you're not going to get any other way, like the flavors that aren't available in commercial food. And I should stress that there is some natural variation for sure in these plants. So some might be bitterer than others, some might be sweeter than others. There's not the kind of conformity that there is in cultivated plants. I think that growing native edible plants and talking about their edible features is a great way to get people really excited about growing native plants. And I know that for you, as for the North American Native Plant Society, your mission is to get people excited about native plants. So I think working in these features of their edibility is one way to do that. It's kind of, I think of them as, think of these plants, these edible native plants, as kind of gateway plants to bigger naturalization or something. I'm going to start with redbud, Cercis canadensis, and actually I should say, so you can see it's flowers loved by bees, native bees, carpenter bees and others. It blooms very early in the season. It's one of the earliest blooming trees, and the tree is covered in these pink blossoms in sometimes as early as April, sometimes May. Now, I've kind of snuck it in here as a native plant, native to Ontario, because calling it a native tree, it was actually, there was a single specimen found on Pelee Island in 1892 by a botanist named John McCown. And that's why we call it native. It's just so beautiful, though. The early flowers, it's so important to the pollinators early in the season that they have a nectar source. So it's a good one. It's a great tree. It's a small tree. You can grow it in shade or in sun. It's very versatile. It doesn't get very tall. You rarely over 30 feet, like it's under 30 feet. It's a small tree. It also produces legume. It's a legume, and it produces these pods, which are also edible. So I eat the flowers in salads. I just, in the spring, it's a great conversation piece at a dinner party or whatever, to have those beautiful pink flowers over the salad, and they're really sweet, and it's like you are, communing with the native bees, because there's this incredible nectar. It's a nectar burst in those little flowers. But it's also nice when now a lot of redbuds are actually sterile and they don't produce the pods, but the trees that do, these pods can be used in stir fry. And serviceberry, another Amelanchier, another well-known native tree in Ontario. Now there's Amelanchier alnifolia, which was probably introduced from the west, but we have a number of native serviceberry species here. The arborea is native to Ontario, the humilis is, and levis, the smooth serviceberry, also native. They all produce beautiful flowers, this incredibly prolific white blooms in early spring as well, again. and so very important for the early insects that are out. And they have, that's in my backyard, so you can see the pollinators. They also produce these wonderfully delicious, juicy fruit. The berries, they taste a bit like blueberries. I find they taste a little bit like, you know, the flavor of an apricot pit? It's a bit almondy. I find that service berries, they remind me of that a little bit. These dark blue or purple, almost black berries appear in July, and the birds love them. So if you can get them before the birds, actually there's usually enough to share, for sure, because they're very prolific. And you can dry them and you can freeze them. And a great thing about the amelanchier, or the serviceberry as well, is it has very beautiful fall foliage. One of my all-time favorite native trees, and it's one that very few people outside of the native plant world know about, and this is a mystery to me. It's Asamina triloba, and I should say, for all you botanists here, I mangle the Latin botanical pronunciation. So, you know, I have an eccentric pronunciation for sure. So this is the pawpaw tree, and it produces the largest native edible fruit in Canada. Not just it is native to Ontario, but it produces the largest edible native fruit of any fruit in Canada. But it's it's unknown. It's so little known. The fruit, it also gets these flowers in early in the season, early in the spring. Incredibly beautiful, cover the tree, close to the branch. The leaves are tropical looking. And then you can see the fruit hidden in the middle there. They're like small mangoes. They look like small mangoes. They taste like a mixture. And again, there's natural variation among specimens, but all of the pawpaws I've tasted have a kind of banana-y, pineapple-y, custardy flavor. They're amazing. And they're not produced commercially. I don't know. For a long time I thought, okay, this is my mission. I want to get commercial pawpaw production somehow off the ground. There's a great group in Toronto, the Toronto Seed Library, that's doing their own pawpaw campaign this year, and they're giving out pawpaw seeds, pawpaw seedlings. They're doing workshops. I'm going to be giving one of the workshops on looking after your newly planted pawpaw tree. As I said, it's a mission. I think everybody should be growing pawpaws. You need a couple of trees to get fruit, but they are incredibly easy to grow. So they are, in fact, they are rare in the wild, but that's not because they're hard to grow. They're super easy to grow, shade, sun. They don't, again, they're a small, I would call them a small tree, 30 feet. Really, they sucker, so you can get more and cut them off and start them somewhere else. Anyway, just a beautiful tree, pawpaw, Asamina triloba. There they are again, the fruit. Wild plum, Prunus americana. We have a native plum here in Ontario. The fruit is, the skin is a little sour, but that's kind of what you want in a plum, isn't it? Sweet and a bit of sour. It's not just food for us, it's also a host plant to the Cecropia moth and also the coral hair-streak butterfly in its larval stage. So it's an important tree for those species. It's got beautiful flowers in the spring. I think it's got beautiful bark as well. Those sort of lenticels on the bark, very beautiful. And then there's the fruit starting in the late summer and through the fall. The tree goes really quickly. It's got good fall color. It gets, maybe to about 8 meters maximum, and the fruit in the autumn. Really nice choice. Chokeberry, a tree that needs a new name, a new common name. Chokeberry, Aronia melanocarpa. Beautiful spring flowers, great fall foliage. The fruit is very abundant. There's look like little blueberries. In the late summer, early fall, it can grow in pretty well any soil. It's very easy to grow, part shade, full sun, very versatile. This fruit actually has the highest level of antioxidants of any fruit in native here. So there has actually been lots of interest in commercializing this fruit. There was some talk about that for a while. But as far as I know, nothing has come of that. It is, I think, one of the best kept plant secrets for sure, and with a lot of potential. Because you can see the flowers are very beautiful, these dense clusters. And now choke cherry, which is Prunus virginiana, another great late spring blooming tree, another small one, up to about 10 meters. Flowers in May and June in these kind of bottle brush clusters. And then it gets these very deep red to black fruit that are very astringent, and they have a large pit. So you would not eat them raw, but when you cook them up, I've got one in my backyard, and I sort of boil it with a bit of sugar and a bit of water and then mash it and strain it. And then I have a sauce to use, in cooking with main courses, or I make an ice cream with choke cherry. It's really fun to, get fruit like that from your backyard, from a tree that maybe, you're not even thinking about as an edible tree, but there it is, and there it's got lots of fruit, and you can experiment with it, with the fruit, and it's a lot of fun. So choke cherry. Hawthorn, Crataegus, there are lots of different species native, and they hybridize quite regularly. So hawthorn, it's a large shrub, a small tree, and the fruits are often called haws. You might have seen haw jelly for sale. There's a tradition of making jelly out of these hawthorn fruit. I've made it, and it works really well. It doesn't have a ton of flavor, but again, it's the idea. I foraged mine from a street tree. It was down on Richmond Street, and the idea of just nothing else was going to happen with those fruit. It wasn't in no way was it affecting any wild population of hawthorns, which grow like wildfire, and you can mainly they're best for jellies, that sort of thing. They're not good raw. Yeah. Nannyberry, Viburnum lentego. It's a great sort of small tree, tall shrub, about up to 10 meters or so. It flowers in late May, early June, and it fruits in the late summer. And you can eat the fruit raw, you can eat it dried. It does have a large seed. Again, this is something have you ever seen a nannyberry for sale, or made into any kind of jam or jelly or anything like that? It is so great to grow these plants so that you can have access to a flavor and a fruit you're not going to see anywhere else or have anywhere else. If you want it, it's you can grow it. Maybe a kind of the best known native tree for food or one of the better known is in Ontario is of course the sugar maple, Acer saccharum, which has beautiful fall color and of course is tapped for syrup. And I guess the syrup is running right now. What I loved is this was a tree in Midtown Toronto, which I saw 2 years ago now. I haven't been back to see if they're tapping again this year. But you can tap trees in the city too, sugar maples. You can tap Norway maples. You need more sap, and it's not as sweet by any means. But sugar maple That's, I guess, one of the better-known native trees that's providing us with food. But there are other trees that you can tap. The birch, the paper birch, Betula papyrifera. So I said I mangled the Latin, and that's an easy one. That's embarrassing. But you can tap paper birch as well for a syrup, or you can tap it for the sap and then boil it down into a syrup. It's a bit, it's almost molassesy, I would say, not as sweet as maple syrup. It's a pioneer species, so I should have said the sugar maple can be grown in shade or sun. Birch, paper birch, it really is. It needs sunny conditions to do well. You can also get sap from shagbark hickory, Caria ovata, and the shellbark hickory, Caria lacinosa. You can also get nuts from them. So you can get nuts. That's the shagbark hickory nut. So this is like a triple, double, triple, quadruple duty tree. Slow growing, incredibly slow growing. I think of the hickories as the trees you plant for the future. You plant for the food for the next for the next generation. But amazing, amazing trees in every way, ornamentally, and for these wonderful edible nuts that are quite sweet. It can grow to like 150 feet. I don't know a lot of people who in a lot of places are planting these really major, massive, huge trees. And it's great that we're planting lots of service berries and red buds and all that, especially in the urban situation. But man, we have to plant some of those big canopy trees too. Shagbark hickory, it's got a large taproot. And you gather the nuts after they fall to the ground, but you have to be faster than squirrels. Black walnut, Juglans nutans, incredibly beautiful bark, this furrowed bark. The nuts are very hard to extract from here. I know people who drive their cars over them to get the meat, the nut meat out of them. You can pickle the green nuts, make pickled black walnut, amazing. You can make an oil from the kernels. And they have great fall color. Now, I should say, I think I said it earlier, but this idea of the natural variation in the flavor, but also one thing to keep in mind with these native edibles is that maybe they're not going to be, the nut isn't going to be as big as the English walnuts that we buy in the store. I mean, there's a reason that those other plants have been commercialized and standardized, but I do think there's a special and unique flavor to these native edible plants that make them worth the extra effort. Maybe not driving a car over them, but that's maybe a bit more. American beech, the Fagus grandifolia. Beech trees, another one. I don't see a lot of newly planted beech trees, and I just think we should all be planting beeches if we have anywhere to plant them. This incredible bark, and the beech nuts are edible. They're sweet. They're great roasted. And this is another one that you gather after they fall from the tree, because of course they're way up high. It's like the black walnut and the shagbark hickory. The nuts are up high, so you have to gather them when they drop. So you're going to be fighting the squirrels, the creatures. And I think I said the great fall color. Beaked hazelnut. We have native hazelnuts here in Ontario, Corylus cornuta. And again, the nuts aren't as, they're not as big as the hazelnuts that you'll buy in the store, but how great is it that you can, grow your own. They have the beautiful catkins in the spring. It's a tall shrub, gets to about 3 meters high. It can grow in shade, which makes it really useful. You roast the nut. There's also the American hazelnut, Corylus americana, and there you can see where the nuts are forming there. So it's a really great shrub. Elderberry, Sambucus canadensis. We have a couple of native elderberries. I've seen the red elder, the Sambucus racemosa. Some authors talk about it, or some early sources, scientists talk about that it's really important not to eat them raw for the red elder, that you have to cook it. I think it's a good idea to cook any of them before eating them, partly because the elderberry fruit, like maybe you're lucky if you find a shrub that's got some good flavor, but for the most part, the fresh fruit, raw, is not super flavorful. But when you cook it, it does become quite flavorful. So you can use it, of course, we all know about elderberry wine and juices. You can make juices out of them. You can make jam or jellies. It's a tall shrub. Some people find it kind of aggressive. I personally have killed 2 of them. So, they like moisture. And so if they're happy, though, they can get aggressive. You can also make a tea, but they're the flowers, beautiful flowers. They're the fruit, incredibly attractive. It's great for wildlife and really versatile. High in vitamin C. The fruit's really high in vitamin C. It's a great, great shrub to plant. New Jersey tea, Ceanothus americanus, it's a sun-loving small shrub, about 4 feet tall, and it's drought tolerant, which is a great advantage of it, and it wants sun, and you can make a nice tea from the leaves. Spice bush, Lindera. Don't you love the way the flowers are so close to the branch? I really love shrubs like that, or trees like the redbud, where the flowers just are so close to the branch. They're also scented. They appear before the leaves in spring. Then they get the fruit in the summer. This fruit, you can dry it and use it as a substitute for allspice if you grind it up. But it's incredibly aromatic, this shrub, hence its common name, spice bush. You can use the leaves and the twigs and the bark for a tea. And the spice bush swallowtail butterfly larva uses this shrub. It's important for it. It was a beautiful, strange-looking creature. Yeah, spice bush swallowtail with its scary markings. Isn't it fierce? Yeah. Staghorn sumac, Rus typhina, beautiful native shrub. I think people are scared of it, People are scared of planting staghorn sumac because when you see it in the wild, it creates these thickets and colonies. It reproduces very rapid spreads, suckers, but in the garden, if you have an area, like if you want a screen or a shrub, like a screen, a fence, and a living wall, something that's going to create coverage really quickly, staghorn sumac is fantastic. And these fruit are so beautiful in the late summer. Plus, they are edible. You can, there's the beautiful fall foliage. Can't beat it. The fruit, you can soak it in water, boiling water. You can soak it and make a wonderful tea or lemon juice. It's funny. Some people call it Rus juice, because that's the Latin name, Rus typhina. So Rus juice. It's a really wonderful lemonade alternative. Yeah, from that. Smooth rose, Rosa blanda, a native rose. Some people are surprised to hear that we have roses that are native to Ontario. We have a number. The rose hips, of course, are fabulous for tea. Wouldn't it be fantastic if there was, if there was commercial rose hip production in Ontario? There's a business opportunity. I don't know how much do rose hips sell for, really, but I don't know. There's lots of rose hip tea. You can make your own from the hips. You can make jelly. They stay on through the winter. It's okay if they freeze. It's in some ways better. They're softer. This shrub needs sun. It wants sun. It tolerates dry. It's a great. It's a low-growing rose. Fly honeysuckle, Lonicera villosa, great woodland shrub, almost like a great shrub for shade. Doesn't get very tall, has these beautiful flowers, but it produces these blueberries that are very much like blueberries, and you can eat them raw or cooked. You can cook with them. It does like a bit of moisture. So I don't think it's very well known that those fruit are edible. Bearberry, Arctostaphylos uva ursi, bearberry, or it's also known as kinnick, which is such a great word. Kinnick, spelled backwards. It's a low-growing shrub. It's evergreen. It's almost like an evergreen ground cover, basically. And it gets these wonderful clusters of small white to pink flowers in the late spring, early summer. It does produce red fruit that are quite mealy, I guess. You wouldn't eat them raw, but you can make a great tea from the leaves, and it's a really wonderful ground cover. High bush blueberry, Vicinium corymbosum, great. We know about blueberries. Well, there's a native one, and very prolific, and then beautiful fall color as well. And it's not that tall. It's not a very tall shrub. Myrica pennsylvanica, the northern bayberry. It grows naturally in moist woodlands, so you can use it as a specimen shrub, as they have here, or you can at an arboretum, but you can also grow it in a shady condition. It does like moisture. And the leaves are an alternative to bay leaves. You can spice your stews and soups with these leaves. Wild grape, Vitis riparia, a wonderful native grape. I mean, it's the flavor. It's not going to be as consistent as the cultivated grapes you get, but you can make a wonderful juice out of it, and in the fall. Great. I thought it had skipped this one. I'm glad there's something strange going on with the technical end of things. But it's here. Yay. It's one of my favorites. It's called groundnut. It's a native plant, Apios americana. And it produces, so these amazing flowers, right? Are they, I don't know, for some reason they make me think of brains. I don't know. So it's a vine, and these flowers are fragrant, and they appear in the summer. And so they twine around things. But what's amazing about this is it produces an edible tuber, just like a potato. It's basically, you can cook it. You don't eat it raw, but if you cook it like a potato, it's edible. Now, of course, this raises the issue of, well, if you're eating all your tubers, you're not going to have the plant and the flowers. So this is a good example of one where, you might want to do some selective harvesting. But how cool to have basically a native potato from the groundnut. So now I'm going to move into some herbaceous perennials, native herbaceous perennials that are edible. Mayapple, Podophyllum peltatum, a fabulous woodland ground cover when it's first coming up. Is that not ridiculous how fabulous they look, these little umbrella soldiers? And then they open out. It's a great ground cover in shade. They don't grow very tall, just under a foot. And they have this beautiful solitary flower, sometimes more, but in late spring, and then they produce this fruit later on, and the fruit is edible when cooked and turned into like a jelly or a jam. Mayapple, again, an aside, I actually think there's some wonderful little home cottage business to be had in making little fancy jams and jellies and beautiful. Maybe NAMPS could do it as a fundraiser or something. Who wouldn't buy Mayapple, a little jar of Mayapple jelly for a ridiculous amount of money to support a good cause. Canada violet, Viola canadensis. The flowers are edible. Why not? The leaves are. Why not put them in salads? It's a great ground cover in shade. Flowers in spring. Ostrich fern. This is one that's very familiar to us, the Matukia struviopteris. That's my mangling of that name. Ostrich fern, then fiddleheads. So, and then of course the ones you don't cut. It's a very prolific fern. It's okay to harvest bits in your garden, and you'll still get lots of growth. Now with the fiddleheads, I found one year. I like cooking vegetables, so they're still a bit crunchy and a little. And I did that with the fiddleheads and had a really bad stomach ache. It's a good idea to cook them like 10, 15 minutes at least, and even change the water, so it can cause stomach upset. Wild ginger, Asarum canadense, a great woodland ground cover for shade, low growing, like 6, 7, 8 inches, beautiful flower. The ants take the little seeds and plant them elsewhere. And what's edible is the tuber, the underground rhizome. You can candy it. A friend made the most delicious dish of peas, like garden peas, and candied little bits of wild ginger root. So he just boiled it up, boiled up a bit of the root with water and sugar, and candied it. Then let it, and chopped it. And then I made it once too, and it worked. And wild ginger spreads well, so it's one that it's kind of easy to cut off a little bit of the rhizome and still have lots left over. Wild leek, Allium trichocum, one of our native alliums that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, because you do start seeing them in the markets in May. They're hugely harvested, foraged, semi-commercial fully commercial industry. I have grown them so it's a woodland plant. It's a plant of old, mature, deciduous woodlands. And you can see it's got these beautiful leaves. It creates a very onion-like flower, and it's the bulb that you can eat, and it's got the strongest, most lovely, garlicky, oniony flavor. The thing about growing them in your garden, I've included it, and I have grown it in my garden, in my woodland garden, but it didn't spread. You really need, it really does want a good old growth woodland. So if you have those conditions, definitely wild leek. And if you plant it, it will, in a woodland, sort of good soil and replenishing your soil and lots of organic matter, it'll grow. I just don't think you'll get a ton to harvest. The Virginia waterleaf, on the other hand, Hydrophyllum virginianum, is one that does grow prolifically, and you can harvest all you want. The young leaves, you can cook them. They get these beautiful flowers as well. It does spread. It's a shade-loving ground cover, or not really ground cover, low-growing plant, like a foot or so, and it spreads quite rapidly and will grow in most conditions, but it does want shade. False Solomon seal, Mayanthemum racemosum or Smilacina racemosa. It's a woodland plant that blooms in early summer with these wonderful white flowers. And again, the young shoots, this is another one that spreads quite rapidly, so you can think about actually harvesting some of the young shoots when they're just up, a couple of inches, and you can cook them like asparagus and eat them like asparagus. So, hog peanut, Amphicarpa bracteata. This is one which produces, so it's got this great flower, But in the late summer, it produces a pod, basically, that you can stir fry. It is a woodland plant, and it can create a great ground cover in shade. It's low growing, hog peanut. As you can see, it spreads. Camassia scoloides. This is the wild hyacinth. Beautiful bluish, whitish, bluish flower in the late spring, early summer. The bulb is edible, roasted. This is one where maybe you'd have to have a lot of them, I think, before you dig one up to eat the bulb. But I've included it because if it's happy, you can have a lot. And anyway, it would be a conversation piece. It's not one where you would be, having wild hyacinth for dinner every night. Wouldn't that be funny? Yeah. Allium cernuum, the wild onion, nodding wild onion, beautiful in it's a low growing, maybe 6, 8, 10 inches tall. These beautiful blue, purpley white flowers, and all parts of it are edible and have an onion flavor. I eat the along with the flowers. You can eat the little bulblets that form after the flowers are done. You can use them stir frying and stuff. Wild strawberry, Fragaria virginiana, very familiar to us. I think they're even more flavorful than any cultivated strawberry I've had in a long time. They're small. The berries are very small, but they're intensely flavor packed. They grow in sun. They can take a bit of shade. They're a great ground cover, an alternative to lawn grass. And you'll get the fruit in June. All these, and quite prolifically, they spread. You can cut off the runners and replant them elsewhere. They'll just anywhere that runner lands, you'll have a new plant. Ground cherry, smooth ground cherry, Physalis subglabrata. I don't know if you know those. They're sometimes called Cape gooseberries that you can buy in the store. They have that. That's the flower. You'll see the husk. That's the husked fruit. I love it. I've seen them referred to as a bladder. I love that. The papery bladder coating on the Physalis. So we have a native Physalis in Ontario. It's this reddish purplish fruit inside, and it doesn't grow very tall, about a foot or so. The ground cherry. Virginia mountain mint, Pycnanthemum virginianum. It's a great flower. This is a sun-loving plant, gets a couple feet tall, but you can use the leaves as an alternative to some of the other mints. It's got a mint flavor, and you can make a tea out of it, out of the leaves, and it's great in a prairie or meadow garden. Virginia mountain mint, Pycnanthemum. Another sun-loving native perennial, Monarda fistulosa, great for native insects, pollinators, butterflies, but also you can use the leaves for a tea. It's got that Earl Grey smell, and it blooms in the summer, gets a couple of feet tall. There's also on the left there is the Monarda fistulosa, and then on the right, the red flowers. These are all just the Monarda dinema. And you can use those, you can sprinkle them on salads. They're beautiful, and it's a very easy to grow, sun-loving plant. Fireweed, Epilobium angustifolium. This is one where in the wild it really spreads, and it can spread in gardens. It likes sun, it's a pioneer species, it does well with disturbance, poor soil, fireweed. But so this is one where it's, you might not worry so much about cutting those young shoots. The young shoots are edible, and you can cook them like asparagus, and you'll still have lots of plants, because it's a pioneer species. It responds well to that. You can also eat the young leaves when they're tender. You can eat them like asparagus. And the older leaves, the more mature leaves, you can make into a tea. And it's such a beautiful plant when it goes to seed as well, late in the summer. Compass plant, Silphium laciniatum. It's a fantastic plant for all kinds of reasons. It's called compass plants. The leaves often orient themselves to the sun. Large, it grows very tall, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 feet, sun-loving. It's related to the other silphiums like cup plant. All of the silphiums, I've really included this more as a kind of novelty plant, because when you cut off the flower heads, there's like a milky sap in there, which you can let harden a bit, and it's basically a chewing gum. You can chew it. Yeah, it's kind of fun. So, but compass plant is a great garden plant, very dramatic and striking with these yellow flowers in the summer. Common milkweed, native plant, Asclepias syriaca. We're all getting the message about how important it is for the monarch butterflies. I included it because my introduction to the edible native plants was with the common milkweed, actually, and the pod, when young, can be cooked and pickled. It's that's one thing. I know a lot of people are worried about how much it spreads. Well, in the garden, you can really keep it under control. In fields, maybe it can get a bit, can certainly take over, but in the garden you can keep it under control, and you can eat the pods cooked. And this is the flower, the beautiful scented flower of the common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca. And then the final plant, I'm going to start where I began, really, with the orich, the Atriplex patula. It does not have a showy flower, but these leaves, I really think that it not only is it this wonderful edible, salad, not salad green, it's a salad purple, beautiful salad purple, but you could use this ornamentally in any garden bed as well. But you can also, so you can eat it in the salads, the leaves fresh in salad, or you can steam it as well, like spinach, and eat it that way. So a couple of things, to just sort of general points to keep in mind about growing edible natives. As I said before, the flavor can vary quite a bit between specimens. There's not the uniformity. The flavor can change quite dramatically when it's cooked. There are sometimes some clues to edibility in the common names. So something like Sagittaria, arrowhead. Another one of its common names is duck potato. So, and actually its tuber is like a potato, basically, and it's edible. For the ones with edible greens, like salad that you might use, it's best to use the young leaves. They often get bitter as they mature. So usually, that's just a sort of general rule, go for the young leaves. For the ones where you're harvesting the roots or the shoots, it's really, if you want to have them in your garden, you can really only harvest just a little bit to leave enough to actually grow. So they're more of an accent, really, in a meal. And so the ones where you're harvesting the leaves, though, you can, in general, harvest more of the leaves without having an ill effect on the plant's growth. And finally, it's really important to exercise some caution and, do a bit of research as well, because it's not a good idea to make assumptions about a plant's edibility. For example, with the milkweed, I knew that you could cook the pods of the common milkweed, you could pickle them, you could eat them, and so I just assumed that you could eat butterfly milkweed, Asclepias tuberosa. You could eat those pods as well. And actually, Peterson's field guide, for example, warns that you shouldn't be eating those pods. So it's good to really, be cautious about this and take care. And there are lots of sources of information. I've included a couple of my books which are totally available at the library. And there are lots of websites. North American Native Plant Society can be your portal. And nurseries, the native plant nurseries. A lot of these plants are now readily available. We're very lucky in Ontario to have a lot of native plant nurseries, so it's important to get these plants from native plant nursery. They tend to have really solid information and want to talk with you about it and offer you lots of advice. I see we've got representatives from Not So Hollow Farm here, Ian and Vicky. So good source. I don't know if you've got catalogs outside, but there are lots of native plant nurseries in Ontario. We're very lucky. So you definitely shouldn't be digging these plants from the wild. But I encourage you to bring them into your garden and onto your plate. Thank you very much.
I don't think thank you even begins to express my admiration for all that Lorraine Johnson has given us this evening. From wanting to immediately go into the garden and then immediately into our kitchens to try many of these things. And I have to say personally, I would really like to be a fly on the wall in Lorraine Johnson's kitchen, because it has just been the realm of information that she has provided us, both in terms of the culinary aspects, but also in terms of the horticultural aspects of how you grow these particular trees, shrubs, vines, and perennials is extremely valuable, and we thank you very much for that. And as well, I find that the emphasis on commercialization and the marketing aspect is something that I think we at NAP should look at, because I think the idea of a fundraiser is fantastic. I'm already thinking about what I'm going to harvest. But I think that it is very, very important also in just educating the general public about the worth of native plants and of people recognizing that there is so much, in the biodiversity of our particular area that most people are quite ignorant of. And often, education often comes through the palate. And so thus I find that this lecture is so apt and so timely. And I want to thank Lorraine Johnson very, very much for all that she shared with us this evening. So thank you, Lorraine.